What impact have the events of the Arab Spring on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? What are the sources of the Palestinian petition for recognition by the United Nations? And how should the United States respond to these new initiatives? Welcome to the Cambridge Forum, Dianna Buttu.
Thank you, Professor Owen, for the introduction. Thank you to the Cambridge Forum for inviting me, and thank you all for attending today. I'm not a student of American foreign policy. I'm really not a student at all these days, but I am going to try to examine what happened and what role the United States played from the start of the negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians in 1993 up until the current day. As I've in the past mentioned, and what I've written in the past, is that one of the fundamental problems that happened with the negotiations process between the Israelis and the Palestinians is that there was and remains a huge disparity in power between Israel and between the Palestinians. Israel is a country. It is a country with a very large army, reportedly the largest army in the Middle East, with nuclear weapons. And the Palestinians are dispossessed, occupied people who are currently stateless. And in that power dynamic, and because of that power dynamic, it was often believed, and still is believed by many, that in order to overcome that dynamic, that there would need to be a third party to balance out the inequality of power between the two sides. Naturally, owing to the relationship between Israel and between the United States, it was very much believed that the United States, would play that role, and that the United States, being the broker of the Oslo Peace Accords, would at least step forward and try to serve as that party that would balance out the imbalance of power. What I want to focus on today is what actually happened. We're now entering into the longest peace process that in modern times, and we're looking at the longest occupation in modern history as well. Given that it's the longest occupation in modern history and the longest peace process over time, I think that it gives us the right to examine what went wrong along the way. Now, as I mentioned, I'm not a student of American foreign policy. My comments are strictly guided by my experiences, not by anything that I've studied, but just my personal reflections on what happened over a period of negotiations. One of the first problems was the fact that during the period of negotiations, the focus ended up being on process and not on substance. And what I mean by that is that there was a great deal of fanfare and applause given to when Israelis and Palestinians met, as though somehow getting Israelis and Palestinians into a room together was unusual, or as though that was the goal in and of itself. And this manifested itself in a number of ways. I'm certain that we all recall the signing ceremony on the White House lawn between Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli Prime Minister. I'm certain that many of us recall the Bush relaunching of negotiations at Annapolis. And I'm sure some of us recall that in 2009, President Obama once again brought the parties together at the White House and once again tried to get a relaunch of negotiations. What I think is ignored, however, is that throughout that period, each time, and specifically throughout the Clinton years, agreements that were reached, rather than being reached, had to be renegotiated time and again. What I think is ignored by many is the fact that during the Clinton years, the 8 years that President Clinton was in office, 5 agreements were signed, but each one of those agreements was a renegotiation of the previous agreement. It wasn't as though there were new agreements or new things that were moving about. It was always a renegotiation of the first agreement that had happened. Similarly, after President Bush brought the parties together at Annapolis in November 2007, very quickly those negotiations fizzled out. And finally, when President Obama brought the parties together in the White House in September of 2010, once again, within a month, the negotiations had fizzled out. And so all of the attention ended up being focused on bringing the parties together rather than actually working on anything of substance. Instead, deadlines were missed, agreements were renegotiated, and the same problems that Palestinians were facing continue to be faced over this period of years. A second main problem that happened during this period was that the United States was and remains very heavily focused on Israeli public opinion, very much to the detriment of Palestinian public opinion, as though there is no Palestinian public opinion. For example, I recall, I'm going to retell a story that was told to me. I didn't hear it specifically, but I'm retelling the story as it was told to me. At one point in time during the period of negotiations during the year 2000, there was a request by a Palestinian negotiator to an American official that the American official put pressure on Israel to stop Israeli settlements. And the American official responded, I can't put pressure on the Israelis right now because we're in a period of negotiations. 6 months later, when the Palestinian uprising began, once again, this same Palestinian negotiator went to the American official and said, the only thing that is going to stop this is if we get to see a stop in settlements, and a stop in the settlement construction, because Palestinians are fed up. And the same official responded in the following way: you can't ask me to put pressure on the Israelis now. Now there's violence. And so what that story is trying to show is that rather than there being any attention placed on Palestinian public opinion, the attention was entirely placed on Israeli public opinion. And I have many, many examples that I can give in that regard, but owing to time, I'm going to keep that short. The third thing that the United States did during this period of negotiations was that it quickly backed down from the positions that it had taken and continued to add extraneous matters to the negotiations. For example, when President Obama took office, in fact, the very first phone call that he made was to the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. Within a few months, there were repeated statements by Secretary of State Clinton, as well as President Obama, demanding a settlement freeze and indicating that Israel's settlement activity in Jerusalem, in particular, should be stopped. If you look now today at the statements by these very same individuals, there no longer is a call for a settlement freeze. In President Obama's latest statements back before the United Nations bid, he didn't even bother to mention the issue of Israeli settlements, nor did he mention the fact that Israeli settlement activity is continuing at an unprecedented rate. Instead, the new extraneous condition that he put into place is that Palestinians now have to recognize Israel as a Jewish state, which was something that was never in any of the agreements that were signed. Moreover, Israel has agreements with Egypt and with Jordan, and in neither of those agreements is there a requirement for a Jewish state. And according to some, including reporters from the Washington Post, this new measure was an extraneous measure that was added in only after 2004. In other words, rather than the United States staying firm and holding a position regarding Israel's illegal actions, it continually let the bar slip and instead added new considerations and new extraneous measures. Finally, there's a whole long list. I've just picked the top four. The final problem with the U.S. and its approach was its approach vis-a-vis the settlements and the United States' unique position to resolve this issue. In particular, on the issue of settlements, I think it's very important to keep in mind that from 1993 until the year 2000, the settler population virtually doubled from close to 200,000 settlers in 1993 to close to 400,000 settlers in the year 2000. Today, according to some estimates, it's as high as 600,000 settlers. Now, throughout this period of time, rather than the United States taking the approach that had been taken in the past, that the settlements are illegal and that Israel has to stop all settlement activity, it very quickly began to water down this position. Today, rather than settlements being considered illegal by the United States, they are now considered to be an obstacle to peace, and in some cases, even worse, quote, unquote, not helpful. In fact, also during this period, the Palestinian attempts to get a UN Security Council resolution have been vetoed by the United States on this particular issue. Now, the uniqueness issue is that given the positions that they've taken in the past, one of the arguments that the United States made was that because of its special relationship with Israel, that it and only it could be the party that would be able to resolve differences. In other words, other powers, other parties were cast aside and ignored, and instead of there being a multilateral approach to resolving this, instead of there being the balancing out of the imbalance of power, it ended up being, in the words of Aaron David Miller, that the United States acted as, quote unquote, Israel's lawyer. Now, I want to take all of that and fast forward to the Arab Spring and very quickly examine, the UN application for membership before the UN, and look at why that happened and what the United States' role has been. I should first say at the outset that I was somebody who was and remained very critical about this application for membership to the United Nations. My criticism does not stem from any of the issues that have been raised by other parties in the past, namely the United States or Israel. My criticism solely stems from an internal Palestinian critique of the fact that there has been no real discussion about this issue internally, and this issue has held up efforts at democratization within the Palestinian, within Palestine. All of that said, I want to explain why the Palestinian Authority felt the need to go to the United Nations, and what the United States' response has been. There were a number of reasons why the Palestinian Authority felt the need to make an application for membership before the United Nations. The first was that, as I mentioned previously, there already had been and continues to be a stalemate and a blockage of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. There have been no negotiations over the course of the past few years, and rather than settlement activity stopping, settlement activity is continuing, albeit, and it's actually continuing at a very unprecedented rate. Just in the month of August alone, the Israeli government approved 5,000 new housing units in the occupied West Bank. So given that there was a stalemate, given that there was no movement on the peace process, the Palestinian president felt that it was very important to try a new move, take a different approach, and hence this application for membership before the United Nations. The second reason was largely one from an internal perspective, which was the one that I was critical of, which is that we have not had elections within the Palestinian Authority for over 6 years for general elections and 7 years for presidential elections. What this means is that the president's term expired 3 years ago. What this also means is that the parliament's term expired more than 2 years ago. We haven't had municipal elections, or what you would call city council elections, for the same period of time. Our parliament, which many people talk about the failure of Congress in the United States, if it could be worse if you just look at the Palestinian Authority's Legislative Council. The Legislative Council has not even met since March of 2007. Now, some people would say that that's a good thing, but I think it all depends on your perspective. Now, given, and moreover, there have been repeated claims and repeated stances that there's going to be reconciliation between Hamas and between Fatah. But of course, that reconciliation has also come to a halt. Those reconciliation attempts have also come to a halt. Given this internal political climate, and given the Arab Spring, it suddenly became imperative for the Palestinian president and the Palestinian Authority to come up with a new strategy, and that was the strategy of going to the UN to seek membership as a state. A third reason that membership before the United Nations was sought was because there was beginning to be growing criticism that there was no alternative strategy that the Palestinian Authority was adopting. In other words, in the words of one commentator, the Palestinian Authority's strategy to negotiations was, if negotiations fail, then just negotiate again. So the alternative to negotiations is more negotiations. And after many years of failed negotiations, there was and still remains a cry within Palestinian circles that a new approach be taken, and this is why the application for membership to the UN was also taken. Lastly, there was the fourth reason that this application was made was because there was a belief that if the Palestinian Authority did everything in its power to demonstrate its ability to be a state, that eventually the international community would one day recognize Palestine as a state. And as part of a state-building plan that was put together in 2009, a plan, by the way, that was applauded by all of the foreign governments, including the United States, and especially the United States, following this plan, the belief was that if this plan was implemented, that the United States would one day recognize a Palestinian state. So these were the four reasons that the application before the United Nations was made. Now, what impact would an application for membership in the United States have, in the UN, excuse me? What impact would an application for membership before the United Nations have? And I hate to report, but virtually none. And I think it's important to highlight this in order to then look at the United States' response. What I mean by none is that there were some commentators who said that if Palestine becomes a member state of the United Nations, it will then be able to attempt to get a resolution demanding Israel's withdrawal from Palestine, from the state of Palestine. I and other commentators responded by pointing to the obvious, which is Israel was in occupation of parts of Egypt. There was no Chapter 7 resolution demanding Israel's withdrawal. Israel remains in occupation of parts of Syria. There is no Chapter 7 resolution demanding that Israel withdraw. Israel was in occupation of southern Lebanon and still remains in occupation of southern Lebanon, and there was and is no Chapter 7 resolution demanding that Israel withdraw. On the flip side, if you look at what the position was vis-a-vis Iraq's invasion of an occupation of Kuwait, very quickly there was a Chapter 7 resolution demanding that Israel withdraw. The reason I highlight this example is to show that a demand that one country withdraw from another is not going to be an automatic response of becoming a member state of the United Nations. The second reason that people feared an application for membership before the United Nations was that there was somehow this fear that the Palestinians are going to use legal mechanisms to try to get Israel to both stop its settlement construction and to demand that it withdraw from occupied territory. But in both of those instances, as we've seen in the past, particularly given the position of the Palestinian Authority when it came to the Goldstone report, these, I think, are mere fig leaves and not something that they were intending on pursuing. In fact, when Mahmoud Abbas was asked whether he intended to go to the International Criminal Court and against Israeli settlements, he was not only said no, he said, our goal in seeking membership before the United Nations is to try to get back to the negotiating table. In other words, that this measure that they were seeking to do was largely for domestic reasons and not for external reasons. Now, the reason that I highlight all of those, what would the impact be, is to then highlight the absurdity of the United States' response to this application for membership before the United Nations. The first reaction ended up being a reaction of hysteria, in which was largely coming from the Israeli side. They called this the diplomatic tsunami, which I haven't seen a diplomatic tsunami, to be honest. I don't know what that is. And then after that, the United States made it very clear that they would veto, or that they would not, that they would put a no vote in if Palestine made such an application. They called for a resumption of negotiations without a settlement freeze, and continue, and have even gone so far today as to cut off funds to the Palestinian Authority, including a program that we all know called Sesame Street. And Congress has cut off funds that go to producing Sesame Street in Palestine. So the reaction has been, rather than the Obama administration or the US in general, taking the stance of believing in Palestinian statehood as they claim to have in the past, or supporting the idea of Palestinian statehood, they instead seem to continue to adopt the same position that the Israelis have, which is to view this as somehow a diplomatic tsunami that is going to be a game changer in the end. Now, I think that there's a few lessons that should be learned from this, and I'm going to stop there. The first lesson is that I think that given what's going on in the Arab Spring, I don't think that the United States is in a position any longer where it can ignore Arab public opinion. For many years, Arab public opinion has been cast aside, and instead support has remained for dictators in the region, all in an attempt to maintain some level or some measure of calm. And calm in particular for Israel. The second is, I think that the United States can no longer ignore the issue of Palestine and the issue of Palestinian public opinion, and it now has to move forward to try to address Palestinian public opinion. And I think the third thing, and the most important thing, is that this peace process has not worked. It will not work. And that instead the United States has to come up with a different model, if not step back altogether. The idea that somehow that we're waiting for an alignment of the stars, for a perfect Israeli prime minister, a perfect Palestinian president, a perfect American Congress, a second-term president, and so on, is something that's just not going to happen any longer. And rather than us waiting, I think it's time that the United States take a completely different approach. I'm going to stop there just in the interest of time and open it up for questions, and thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll start with two questions, if I may. I'm sorry I'm talking over your right shoulder. Yeah. The first is, you didn't in the end mention the Arab Spring, but one way of bringing it in would be that that somewhat defeated Mahmoud Abbas's attempt to use the going to the UN in order to bolster his opinion. I mean, in that sense, he was unfortunate, although, because nobody could have in fact predicted, but I think that is true, isn't it, that his, whatever gains he may have got from announcing that the Palestinians would ask for statehood, that a recognition by the UN that those have been lost by the attempts by young Palestinians to demonstrate in Ramallah. And I think the second point is, I mean, even if you give all the kinds of whatever is going on with the American administration, what do they actually mean by a two-state solution now? Is there a map? Is there something or other? Or is it just words? Thank you.
So regarding your first question, Professor Owen, on the Arab Spring actually defeating Abbas, it's interesting. I think you're right. I think that the Arab Spring really shaped his reasoning for going to the United Nations. And at the same time, while he did get a surge in support immediately after the application was made, current polls are suggesting that his actual support has very quickly dropped. In part, one of the reasons that he went to the United Nations was because in Palestine there was a different type of Arab Spring. So unlike in Egypt and Tunisia and Bahrain and Syria, in which the slogan was "Sha'b yurid isqat al-nizam," people want to topple the government, the slogan in Palestine was, interestingly, the people want reconciliation, or people want an end to the division, reconciliation. And very quickly, it became both in Hamas's interest and in Fatah's interest to demonstrate to protesters that this was something that they were going to do. It was in both of their interests because they wanted to quell protest. It was also in their interest because Hamas was now having problems with the Syrian government. And so they ended up announcing in April that they were coming together and they were reconciling. Now, interestingly, from April until today, there hasn't been a reconciliation agreement. There have been lots of attempts at reconciliation, but there still hasn't been a reconciliation agreement. We still have the same government. So one of the reasons that led to him making this application before the UN was because he wanted to defeat all of that internal protest. But given that there has been no reconciliation, and given that the Arab Spring continues, you're precisely right in saying that as much credit as he ended up getting, it very quickly fizzled out because people recognized it for what it was, which is more or less a publicity stunt. Secondly, your question was, what does the United States mean by a two-state solution? That's a very good question. I wish I had the answer to it. I think that what has been proposed in the past is something that will never be achievable. And what they propose, from a Palestinian perspective, what they proposed in the past is, one, a truncated state, West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, only parts of East Jerusalem under Palestinian control, but the vast majority of it under Israeli control. Large swaths of land taken up by Israeli settlements, and making sure that there's this maximal formula of as many Israeli settlers on as few Israeli settlements, and also the idea of a demilitarized or non-militarized state with very little control over airspace, very little control over natural resources. And finally, the United States' version of a two-state solution doesn't have any resolution for Palestinian refugees. So throughout the period of negotiations, there has never been a map that's been presented by the American administration. There have been parameters that have been presented by the American administration, which I just spelled out to you. But there's never really been a map. And this, in part, is the problem, which is that when the United States, rather than relying on principles of international law, they are leaning towards and relying on, not leaning towards, they adopt principles of power. And with the idea being that the more powerful party gets to dictate the terms of the two-state solution. I think that we are now so far off of this idea of the two-state solution that it's time for this administration and for the rest of the world, actually, not just this administration, to start looking beyond the idea of a two-state solution.
Questions from the audience, and please, if they could be one, two, the gentleman in the blue there. Questions rather than long statements. Thank you.
Well, your last sentence leads into my question. You said the United States has to look beyond something or other, and it does seem to me that the likelihood of a just two-state solution is zero in the foreseeable future, and the likelihood is becoming even below zero, I think, the more time passes with enlargement of settlements, et cetera. And so doesn't it seem possible then that at some point the Palestinians will switch over to the idea of a one-state solution, even though they've been rejecting it solidly for many years? But it seems to me at some point they have to give up on the two-state solution, but I don't know what you think.
I agree with your statement that the likelihood of a just two-state solution is zero. And I'll explain why I believe that, and then I'll explain whether the one-state solution is an option. My answer is going to be a little bit long. I hope it won't be too long, but why I believe that the two-state solution has zero possibility at this point. People look at the idea of the two-state solution, and there's somehow a belief, when I ask people, when did it die? Or what will make it no longer feasible? There never really is a concrete answer that people give me. It's sometimes they look at the number of settlers, they look at the number of settlements, etc. Now, if 2005, with Israel's withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, showed one thing, it showed that settlements can be dismantled and settlers can be evacuated, albeit in very small numbers, but it can be done. The problem is not the number of settlements. Now, I say that just so that you understand the thinking. I do think that the number of settlements is a problem, but I'm saying this just so that you understand my logic. the problem is not the number of settlements that continue to be built and expanded. The problem is that since 1967, there has been a mindset that has been created among the Israeli settler movement and inside Israel that the settlements are okay. And not only that, there's a mindset that the land is Israeli land to be colonized. This is the problem. And what's happened over the course of the past almost 45 years now is that nobody has really challenged that frame of reference or that type of thinking. So today, every proposal, if you look at proposals or if you've looked at the proposals in the past that has come from the Israeli side, always stresses this idea that some, if not all of the settlements should remain, meaning that they haven't challenged the mindset and are unwilling to challenge the mindset. Instead, the approach is that the settlements are here to stay, and you Palestinians just have to deal with it. It doesn't matter if they're legal or illegal. It doesn't matter what the legal status of them is. And because of this mindset that has been created, the mindset doesn't just exist within Israeli settlers, who are, even now, the Israeli government is having problems evacuating some of the settlements that the Israeli government itself deems to be illegal. All of them are illegal under international law. But because of that mindset, it's now spilled over into the general Israeli population. So if you ask the Israeli population, do you believe in the two-state solution, you'll get overwhelmingly positive responses. I think the last number was 70%. Let's say even above 50%. That's a huge number. But when you get down into the details of what they actually believe is the two-state solution, this is where the problem lies, which is that there's always this idea that Palestinians have to make concessions to Israeli settlement activity. And because of that, and because that mindset is unwilling to be challenged, I don't think that a two-state solution is possible anytime soon. Now, on the issue of the one state and the one-state option, there are a number of Palestinians who are speaking more and more about the idea of one state. There are a number of concerns that people have, which is this going to be one state? Is it going to be a binational state? Even if it is one state, is there still going to be Israeli control? What is a constitution going to look like? Will Israel have any influence in our education system? Will there be any influence on issues of religion? I mean, what is this idea of a two-state solution going to look like? And there are a number of people who've been thinking through what a one-state solution, what will a one-state solution look like? And there are a number of people who are thinking through this idea. I want to tell you, though, that the idea of one state is still not 100% accepted in Palestinian circles. It's accepted by many, but it's still the dominant thinking seems to be the two-state solution. And I'm going to give you just a very short example of something that happened a few years ago. In March of 2010, Senator George Mitchell was coming to Ramallah and to Bethlehem to visit the Palestinian president, and in order to try to relaunch talks. And very interestingly, around that same time, there were a number of very large billboards in prime billboard space across all of the major Palestinian cities. And the billboards read, "Two states are impossible. One secular state is the only solution." And they were sponsored by a group that called themselves Takamul, which means to make something whole or to make something perfect. Now, Palestinians generally do not deface commercial signs. It's a very interesting trait, but they generally don't deface commercial signs. In fact, there's a very interesting anecdote in Banksy's book when he was describing his trip to the West Bank, and he started spray painting on the wall. A Palestinian man asked him, "Why are you doing this?" And he said, "We don't want you to make this wall any more beautiful, and we don't believe in defacing things." So I thought that was very interesting. But anyway, back to the billboards. Very quickly, within actually 48 hours, all of these billboards were completely defaced, completely. And I was walking past as one guy was actually defacing one of the billboards. Again, this is very unusual. And I asked him, why he was doing it. And all I had to do was just look up and read what he had written on this billboard. And it said, "The blood of our martyrs is worth more than this." And he also said, "This is not what we've been struggling for. This is what was the other thing? This is not what our prisoners want." Now, when I asked him, I had an opportunity to ask him, and I said, "Why did you deface this?" And he said, I want to live in my own state. You might consider that to be unreasonable, but this is what I want. I just don't want the Israelis controlling my life anymore." So there is a lot of debate among Palestinian circles about this idea of two-state versus one state. I think that more and more Palestinians are going to start exploring the concept of one state, but it's going to require a lot of work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for a very, very
Thank
interesting presentation.
Thank you.
At the beginning of your opening, or at the end of your opening remarks, you indicated that the American approach of bringing the two sides to the negotiating table hasn't worked and isn't going to work. I think you're absolutely right. Then you hinted that America should adopt another approach, but you didn't say what that might be. And I'm just wondering if you could suggest to us, what do you think America should do? What can it do? Or indeed, can America deal with this question successfully? And is there anyone else, are there any other parties that might be able to help bring this Israeli-Palestinian conflict to a conclusion? Thank you.
Yeah. So I'll first start with what America can do. I think that what the United States can do is very limited, given the fact that this is not just an international issue. This is largely considered a domestic issue in the United States. And given that it's also a domestic issue in the United States, and given what we've seen over the course of the past 20 years, I don't think that it's possible for any American president to do anything differently. I mean, Palestinians often have this hope in a second-term presidency. I don't. I'll be very clear. It hasn't proven to be the case in any second-term presidency since I can at least remember. I think that the approach that the United States should be doing relates in large part to the approach that the Palestinians should be taking. And the approach, unfortunately, has been, so far, not only to support this endless peace process, but it's also been to support Palestinian leaders who are no longer democratically representative of the people. In other words, as I had mentioned earlier, all of our leaders, so to speak, elected leaders, are out of time. Their terms have expired, and rather than the United States pushing for new elections, it continues to be stuck in that same framework, hoping that the peace process and these individuals are going to lead to one. So it goes back to your first question, which is, what should the approach be? And I think that the approach needs to be led by Palestinians, meaning that there already have been a number of Palestinians who are calling for a different approach to dealing with Israel, one that makes Israel accountable to the international community for its actions. So everything from pushing for boycotts, pushing for divestments, pushing for sanctions. These are, I think, Palestinian-led initiatives that they've already begun, but they have to continue to take off in more earnest. And so far, while there have been civil society calls for boycotts and divestment and sanctions, the Palestinian Authority leadership hasn't actually adopted any of those moves. So I think that what needs to happen is, first, within Palestine and within the larger Palestinian movement, we need to get our act in order. We need to start pushing for elections. We need to start pushing for a new strategy. And that strategy should be one that, again, holds Israel accountable for its violations of international law. And from there, what the United States should be doing is not blocking that. Can there be another party that can take the lead? I don't think it's a question of one party or another party taking the lead. I think it's more a question of whether they're going to block any homegrown initiatives that will happen.
Thank you. Yes, at the back. Yes. Please, no, you. Yes, yes. Thank you.
Hi, I enjoyed your talk. I just wondered whether you might comment on the possibility of a following sort of Palestinian gambit, negotiating gambit, which would involve the allowance of Israeli settlement expansions to be offset by traded land. That is, for every hectare or acre or whatever, of land that the Israelis annex in the West Bank, that an equivalent quantity of land acceptable to the Palestinians would be given over to the Palestinian nation state, and that for every settler who intends to continue to live on the West Bank, a Palestinian refugee from outside of, from the DP camps would be allowed to live either in the newly annexed Palestinian territory from the other side of the Green Line, or in the West Bank, or in Gaza. So that seems to me to be a fair gambit. That if the Israelis rejected that, it would appreciably strengthen the case of the Palestinians and appreciably weaken the case of the Israelis. I myself am, I'm not a Zionist hater by any means. But I think that the very religious Israelis are too much in control of the process, and they have no intention of, and they're in control, and they don't really seem to have any intention of giving anything. And that's very unfortunate for the United States. It's unfortunate for for Jewish Americans. I don't think it's helped our case in the eyes of the country or the world. And it's unfortunate for the region. I wondered if you could comment on any of that.
Sure. I'm going to comment on your second part before I get to your proposal, which is the idea that the Israeli settlers are not in the process of giving up much and are really pushing things. You're absolutely correct in that. In order to understand the influence of the Israeli settler movement, you have to just step back a little bit and look at the Israeli Knesset, or the parliament. In order to get, so since I'm trying to remember history now. Let's just say over the past 25 years at least, I think I might be mistaken on some of the numbers, every Israeli government has been formed not by one party completely winning an election, but through a process of coalitions. In the Knesset, there are 120 seats, and nobody has ever managed to successfully get 61 seats. No one party has managed to get 61 seats to be able to rule. And so instead, a coalition needs to be created with some of the smaller parties. And when you create coalitions, it's a horse trade, and you need to give in order to get. And so coalitions, at least over the course of, let's just look at the peace process years since 1993, every coalition has been formed with members of the Israeli right wing or the Israeli settler groups. Okay? And the horse trading that is conducted is of two types. One, to get more benefits for Israeli settlers, and two, in order to be able to build more settlements themselves. And so each government, over the course of the past 20 years, including Rabin, continued to build and expand Israeli settlements, in large part because it was a domestic issue in order to keep their coalition together. But all of that being said, that continued settlement construction and expansion and all of the benefits that go to settlers has never turned into an Israeli election issue. And the reason it's never turned into an Israeli election issue is it goes back to the point that I made earlier about the two-state solution, which is that the mindset has never been challenged. This idea that Israel is entitled to the land is not something that has been challenged within Israeli circles. No, it hasn't.
I think that's inaccurate, but that's just my opinion. With all due respect, I think that it has been challenged.
It hasn't in terms of any of the election cycles. There are occasions.
You'll have to come to the microphone.
Yeah.
Because of our listeners.
But beyond that, so I mean, we can disagree on this, but I can demonstrate why this hasn't been the case. Going back to your issue of the proposal that you suggested, the proposal that you suggested unfortunately fits within that same model that I mentioned earlier, which is that it's not a model that is based on international law or on things that are legal and illegal. It's based on the notion of power, and that the Israeli settlements are there, so you might as well just accept the fact that they're there. What I find very interesting is that rather than us doing these mental acrobats of trying to figure out how many settlers and what land, et cetera, I think it would be very easy if there was just a law that was passed by the Israeli government stating the fact, two things. One, if you're going to stay that you have to leave, the settlements have to be evacuated. And if not, then you're going to have to live under Palestinian rule. I mean, I don't see why we have to go through all of these acrobats of drawing a map and where is this, where is that, et cetera, when there is international legal references that can and should be referred to. Secondly, when it comes to the issue of, you mentioned for every settler that remains, a Palestinian refugee gets to live in the newly annexed territory or gets to live within the West Bank and Gaza Strip. I think that there's a problem with that, which is that you're trying to equate the two as though somehow the two are equal. Palestinian refugees have a right under international law. And I don't think that you can try to offset their right with the wrong that has been created by the Israeli settlers. In other words, they're not on par with one another. The Israeli settlements are illegal completely under international law. And to somehow adjust those and to offset them by a Palestinian right isn't something that is going to strike any Palestinian as fair. Of course, I'm not a Palestinian negotiator, I'm not a Palestinian leader, but I can tell you what I believe most Palestinians would say on this.
Thank you a lot for your elucidation of all of these things and their intricacies. I'm wondering, though, whether the whole Palestinian-Israeli confrontation might be in danger of experiencing a much greater catastrophe, in a sense, and that is climate change. Climate change. In two particular respects. You've indicated the sensitivity around the question of settlements. But beneath that is not just land, it's water. Yeah. And water is doing something very different, both in Palestine and in Israel these days, and in the projected future. The whole region is experiencing a desiccation on a scale we haven't seen. Yeah. Secondly, in terms of sea level rise, this is occurring at a pace none of us predicted. I mean, us in the human community. None of the scientists predicted. And it doesn't leave much margin for places like the Gaza Strip, where there are two roads, basically, one along the beach and one a little bit further in, both of which will be underwater at current projections by the end of this century. And millions of people are going to be displaced, not just in Israel, but in all of the circum-Mediterranean. Now, it's often been put forward as a means of bringing together Israelis and Palestinians if they can together address a commonly emerging problem. On the other hand, if it deteriorates into a resource war for the last available fresh water supplies, or even if it continues along the lines, as I'm sure you're aware, it's apparent that Israel's reticent to let go of the Golan Heights in part because it has some control over the water supply. Yeah. Even if that trajectory continues business as usual, it doesn't look very promising. Do you think there's any vision on either side, Israeli or Palestinian sides, to embrace the commonality of the crisis?
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. Unfortunately, I think I'm going to have to say no. And the reason I say this is that I know that in the past there have been attempts to try to address the issue of the scarce resource of water. But the problem is that unlike most problems, it's a fixed pie. And because it's a fixed pie, the idea is whatever I take is something that's less for you. And because of the power model that exists, it has largely been the case that Israel controls the water, and what Israel takes, that means there's less left for the Palestinians. Actually today, not today, but there have been a number of different studies that have come out, actually one very recently that came out by the World Bank that examined Palestinian water rights, and another by Human Rights Watch that also looked at Israel's consumption of water. And in this, as well as other reports, it's clear that Palestinians consume less than the World Health Organization's minimum standard per person per day, by something like, I think the minimum is 100 liters per person per day, and Palestinians are somewhere in the area of 70 to 80 liters per person per day. Whereas Israeli settlers are 9 times that, and Israelis living inside Israel are, I think, somewhere in the tune of 4 or 5 times that number. I might be a little bit conservative right now in my numbers. The reason that this won't be addressed, I fear, is because of that fixed pie and the fixed pie perception. And so it's tragic when you see, when I used to live in the Gaza Strip, and when you see that in the Gaza Strip 90% of the water that is there is unfit for human consumption. When taking a shower, you could often smell this seawater that was coming on us. In order to be able to drink water, we just have to lug bottles of water, which is also not very good for the environment, up many, many, many stairs. When the electricity got cut by the Israeli government, or by the Israeli army, excuse me, we couldn't pump water up any longer, and most buildings in Gaza are high-rises. And there's been sewage that has seeped into the water aquifer in the Gaza Strip, which is why it is no longer drinkable. Similarly, in the West Bank, we face chronic water shortages. The agricultural industry is on the decline because there isn't access to water. And yet, Israelis get to grow bananas inside Israel, but Palestinians are told what they should and should not be growing. I think the only way out of this is precisely the model that you've proposed, which is to view it as it's supposed to be viewed around the world, as a shared resource. And then, as a shared resource, trying to allocate that rather than trying to deplete it. I think that we're so far off from that because water is so intertwined with all of these other issues. It's intertwined with politics, with land, with settlements, with you name it. It's all intermixed, and yet it should be something that there should be cooperation rather than competition.
Last question, and oh, sorry, this gentleman hasn't asked a question. I think he has. Thank you.
I was just curious, getting back to the question of the previous failed negotiations, if you have a sense of why neither side seemed to ever accept the positions that were developed, I guess, multiple times over the last 2 decades by people, let's say people of goodwill of both sides meeting and coming pretty much to the same conclusions as to how a 2-state solution could be arrived at. And I guess sort of as a side observation, I'm not sure that relying on international law as the prime, your prime measurement is necessarily helpful, given that international law seems to be flouted in lots of ways when it comes to politics and the politics of power. So basically, how come, what drove both the Palestinians and the Israelis away from the kinds of positions that their sort of non-political leaders were coming up with?
I see, okay. Well, I'm going to start by just a little bit of history and then take it all the way up to some of the various initiatives that have been put on the table. In terms of history, I think that we do a disservice by just looking at the West Bank and the Gaza Strip without looking at it in the context of a historical compromise. The West Bank and the Gaza Strip were not Palestine, historically. It's 22% of what was Palestine. And in 1988, when a decision was taken to declare independence on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, that was a very big decision. It was a huge, I mean, it came 20 years after the start of Israel's occupation, 21 years, and wasn't a decision that was taken lightly. In fact, it went through a lot of different debates. And so when Palestinians talk about Palestine, it's right now, in terms of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, that 22% has to be put in context of a huge historical compromise, which is 78% of the country that they said no to, that they gave up on. So the problem is that now, Israel took that 78% and put it in his pocket, and then started to negotiate on the remaining 22%. For Palestinians, the idea was, we're not going to negotiate anymore on this 22%. We're going to negotiate arrangements, but we're not going to negotiate more and give up more of our territory. And so for the majority of Palestinians that you speak to, it's this idea that we've already given up so much. Why do we have to give up more? And we're giving up more for illegal settlers. And I know that you might have a problem with the idea of international law, but there is a principle that you can't acquire territory by force and settlements are illegal. It's now considered a war crime. I mean, these are not light things to be brushing over. But this is the whole point, is that people are just looking now at the 22% and demanding more and more concessions on something that was already done. Now, so that's on the Palestinian side. On the Israeli side, it was somewhat the same mindset, which is, okay, they've accepted us on this 78%, but we have all these settlers on the other side. You know, they can accept a little bit more. And we have all of these internal domestic problems, which I already elucidated. And so, they have to make concessions, more concessions. So they took the 78, put it in their pocket, and then started to negotiate it on the remaining 22%, right? And so then you fast forward, and you've got this problem now, which is Israel doesn't want to confront the settler movement. End of story. It doesn't want to confront this mindset that's been created that they can continually take more land and demolish homes and build settlements and do all that stuff. And for Palestinians, they've already said, we've compromised enough. 78% is huge. If we really want to talk about fairness, let's do 50-50, right? This is what some people are saying now. Or let's do one state for everybody. So that's where the problem lies. Then I'm gonna take it into a number of the different initiatives that have been created. There was an initiative called the Ayalon Nuseibeh Plan, which initially started off on this position of 67 borders. Whatever was occupied in 67, Israel has to withdraw from. And in exchange, the Palestinians will give up on the right of return. That's the way that it started out. And there was a lot of Palestinian criticism about this. But it didn't stop there. Again, Israel took the Israeli person behind this initiative, took the idea of no refugee return, put it in his pocket, and then started demanding more negotiations on territory. So that was one plan. Didn't go anywhere within Palestinian circles. Second plan that came along was the Geneva Initiative. A lot of money pumped into the Geneva Initiative, an Israeli negotiator, a Palestinian negotiator, and the same framework, which is limited right of return for Palestinians. In fact, no right of return, but just but Palestinians can go to the Palestinian state. And again, the same framework of Palestinians having to give up more territory. Now, it got a lot of play in the outside world, but if you ask Palestinians, They kept saying the same thing, which is we've already given up so much of our territory. Why do we have to give up more? And this is the reason that I believe that these negotiations are going to continue to fail. It's not a question of stubbornness. It's a question of actually positioning yourself legally. And Palestinians have positioned themselves on the basis that there is an international, there are international legal norms out there, and we should be following those international legal norms. And why should we be beneath those international legal norms, and why should Israel be above it? So this I think encapsulates very quickly a response to your question.
Thank you, Dianna Buttu.
Thank you. Thank you.